distresses me to hear you talk the way you do, or to see what you said, read what you said. I happened to have the onerous duty of going into Buchenwald right after the surrender of Germany. I saw the camp. I saw some of the survivors. I saw the ovens. So I don't really understand how, what is it, 40 years later? Here I am sitting here talking with a guy who says it didn't happen.
Well,
I mean, how can you say something like that?
Let's analyze your nice homily and take it segment by segment. You were an American serviceman. You went into a German concentration camp or internment camp, and you saw the bodies, you said, and you saw the prisoners in there, and you saw the ovens. Every German city of note, every European city of note, every Canadian city of note has ovens. That's crematoriums. That's not under dispute. That there were prisoners in there, that's not under dispute. That they were skinny at the end of the war, that's also not under dispute. What is under dispute is whether there was a policy of planned genocide by a government body. That's what the issue is.
Really, in many ways, we're doing a disservice to have you on the air. I think it is a loathsome situation where anybody gets, and that's what's wrong with the Canadian law, that they have made you a front page figure. But I still am quite interested on where you're coming from. How old were you in 1945, sir?
I was 6 years old.
And when did you decide that this was all a smear against Germany?
After I was able to get some factual information in North American libraries. You see, in Germany...
What's your education, Mr. Zundel?
My educational background is that of any two-legged Homo sapien.
What's your education?
Pardon?
How educated are you? Are you a researcher?
I took a number of years of political science, and I publish. I'm the author of some 12 books and booklets. I publish an internationally circulated newsletter.
You have no particular degree and no particular expertise in history or research?
Christ didn't have a degree in Christianity. Marx didn't have a degree in Marxism.
We're not arguing. Why don't you live in Germany?
I might just do that one of these days.
Mr. Zundel, you would like to see a Nazi revival in Germany, would you not?
Not really.
I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, most of the Germans of today couldn't fit, number one, get their uniform jackets tied, and they would trip over their own feet marching down with their beer bellies.
Mr. Zundel, what is that hat you're wearing? What does that signify?
This is my good luck charm. You see, when I appeared in my first court appearance, I was knocked down, assaulted from behind and knocked down. The second time I was hit over the head by demonstrator sticks, and that was just shortly before a bomb went off at my house. All this because I hold this rather unusual view on history, you know. So I would say that the opponents of my viewpoint are the ones that are intolerant and violent.
All right.
I'm a man of debate, peace, and democracy.
Let me get you back for 1 second to the history of this thing. General Petrenko, I think his name was the Russian general who captured Auschwitz, and he has testified that the Holocaust did take place because he and his troops moved in there.
Yeah, well, he also...
How do you account for the fact?
The Soviets also...
Wait a minute, let me finish.
Yeah,
how do you account for the fact that the United States and the Russians, General Eisenhower and General Petrenko, both say the same thing, even though, as you know, the United States and the Russians are not in very friendly terms?
And the German government, the West German government, and the East German government both say the same thing.
Well, isn't that a coincidence? That exactly tends to prove my point of view. If there was a self-respecting government in West Germany, you wouldn't get all this cozy agreement. As a matter of fact, the West German government leaders were hurt that they were not allowed by the Americans and all the other allies to help celebrate the kind of invasion of Europe by the American armed forces. But I'd like to come back to your glorious ally, Soviet General Petrenko. He's the same fellow that tried to blame the murder of the Polish elite, the officer corps in Katyn, on the Germans. And when the Germans proved that they had the goods on the America's erstwhile democratic ally Uncle Joe's troops, suddenly, quietly, the charge was dropped.
So you can't believe a word he says. Well, all right, we'll come back to that.
Anything the Soviets say, I would take with a grain of salt.
I've never heard of you if it hadn't been for this trial.
Well, you see, that might be true, but the thing is, as a citizen charged with an offense, I had to appear in court.
But that put into your hands, did it not?
Well, if I turned a bad situation, which cost me about $100,000 to defend myself, into a positive kind of jiu-jitsu in the political sense, then I think that's not only my right, it's my duty.
You were delighted to be in court, weren't you?
Well, I'm an advocate of free speech. More than my opponents who are charging me with fascism and all this stuff, I basically love freedom of speech, and I think it was a travesty of justice to put a writer and a publisher into court for publishing some, let's say, an alternate opinion or a dissident viewpoint.
You're a great admirer of Hitler. You told me what a fine man he was. There was no freedom of speech whatsoever in Nazi Germany, was there?
Well, that's your opinion.
No, I'm asking you a question.
There was lots of freedom of opinion in West Germany. I've read lots of books.
You know, look, we've almost really had enough of this, Mr. Zendel. We have history, we have eyewitnesses, we have archives. The Germans, as you know, are a very methodical people. Let me
have one side of history.
The German army left behind it maps and designs and order blanks and Zyklon B gas and when it came into the camps and when it left. It's all documented, and here you are 40 years later giving us this stuff, and you know, I say it's okay for you to hold an error, at least it would be in this country, but you really ought to try to get yourself educated. What would you say? What would you say? What do you say to the fact that Robert Wolfe over at the National Archives, right here in Washington, D.C., has models and orders and designs for those gas chambers which were taken from the German archives?
Researchers have combed the National Archives for me in Washington, D.C. All they came up with for my trial was a doctored documentary, which didn't agree. The transcript didn't agree with the film that we were seeing.
Mr. Zendel, you know, when you're trying to make this argument, which some unsuspecting people might think has some validity, don't you know, when you say that there was free speech in Germany, when there's records of journalists, of authors going into concentration camps, don't you know that you discredit your whole argument? I mean, aren't you smart enough to know that?
Well, we are not here to run for a political popularity contest.
I'm talking about popularity. I mean, don't you know that just absolutely discredits your whole argument when you say there was free speech? There was no liberties of any kind.
No, there were tens of thousands of journalists writing in Germany during the Third Reich and the Second World War.
Well, that's
I have read many of the books.
Have you read those newspapers? They were all censored. They were the party line. There was no criticism.
Look, in the United States, you had very strict censorship.
Oh, that is nonsense.
Canada, we had very strict censorship.
That's nonsense. There was criticism of the regime through the whole... You see, the thing that I resent about this whole business is that I end up arguing with this loony, and it is just absolutely despicable.
Look, Mr. Zendel, I'd like you to explain to me, if you can, why it was. You said the Jews foisted this propaganda about the Holocaust. How is it that the Jews are so powerful that they can get Russians and Germans and French and Americans and British all to agree on the details of the Holocaust?
Okay, just let me answer this way. Number one, I didn't say what you said I said. And number two, I don't think that this short program would give me the scope to possibly try to explain it.
Well, you said that it was all propaganda, and that it was, you said earlier on that it was all propaganda, and that it was begun during the war and continued thereafter. I suppose you mean it was Jewish propaganda.
Well, you said that. I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that World War II propaganda is around us today, posing as history, all that I was trying to do, and hope that my human rights in the world and democratic rights and privileges
all right, one more question. You were six at the time. There were people in those camps. There were people in those camps who were a little older, and some of whom escaped, like Mr. Wiesel. He wrote a book called Night, which is a marvelous documentary of a concentration camp. Do you think he just made this all up?
Let's take a close look at Elie Wiesel's left arm, and while we're at it, at his right arm as well. Evidently, no sign of an imprinted tattoo can be seen.
Name Eli, something that died.
He just died, and we're happy about that, because this guy here was the biggest liar ever, and he never was taken to task for his lies. You know, he claims he was in Auschwitz, his family was in Auschwitz, you know, and then he says he was in Buchenwald, and, you know, all these places he said he was, and, you know, he comes out writing this book, Night, whatever it is there, and, you know, he made a lot of money. I mean, the guy made tons of money on it, and basically it's just all based on lies. So, you know, we're glad he's dead because...
Well, during my trial, I had an expert witness come to this court case in Toronto, and he said, and he was a German fellow under oath, he was there as an official for a whole year, and he said that these things were not true. So whom am I to believe?
Mr. Zundel, you were talking about a citizen's rights. You're not a citizen of Canada, are you?
I'm a citizen of the world. I have got, according to the United Nations Human Rights Charter, I have got the right to inform myself, and I have got a God-given right and a natural right.
What country are you a citizen of?
No Canadian politician, no Canadian Parliament needs to give me any rights. I take the right to express my opinion.
Did you get a fair trial?
Pardon me?
Did you get a fair trial?
No, I did not.
Why?
Because half of the evidence was not allowed, since of course I was German. Many of my documents were Germans. We were not allowed to show.
Nonsense. That's why.
Hold it for a minute. We were going to introduce over 200 slides taken by experts and a person that investigated these camps. We were not allowed to show those slides. We were not even allowed to show American Air Force overflights, meaning aerial photographs of the camps in 1944 and 45. This deprived me of an adequate defense, and of course we will appeal it.
Mr. Zundel, have you ever had been under psychiatric care? I'm curious.
Actually, I had a psychiatrist who was one of my best witnesses for the defense, and he was a guest in my home. I didn't see that he was fleeing out of my house.
Well, you don't quite answer the question, but that's all right.
No, I have no. Right. To answer, I'll answer directly. No, I have no history of mental illness, and don't propose to develop one tonight on this program.